She looked the king in the eye and said, "It's them or the crown." It started not with a grand announcement or formal ceremony, but with a glance, a single, measured look from Princess and during a public engagement beside her brother, King Charles III. Observers saw it. Royal analysts paused. Social media buzzed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. And to those familiar with the internal currents of the British royal family, it carried the weight of a political earthquake. Princess Anne had just made it clear she wasn't sitting in the background anymore. She was stepping forward, not as a queen, not as a would-be ruler, but as the last unshakable pillar of a monarchy being tested from within and without. Before we continue, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What followed in the days and weeks after that moment has sparked the most aggressive internal royal shakeup since the days of Prince Andrew's disgrace. Only this time, the target isn't someone accused of misconduct under the law. It's Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, two figures who were once celebrated as modernizers of the monarchy and who are now increasingly seen, by those inside the palace, as existential threats to its survival. Behind closed doors, a stunning ultimatum has reportedly been delivered. One not made in whispers or veiled statements, but with icy clarity by the Princess Royal herself. According to palace insiders, Anne looked her brother in the eye and spoke the words now echoing through royal history, "It's them or the crown." At first glance, it may seem like melodrama, tabloid frenzy dressed up in regal clothing. But this isn't just about petty jealousy, generational divide, or personal grievance. This is about power, legacy, preservation. The institution that outlasted empires now finds itself battered by scandals that refuse to fade, and at the very heart of it lies a question more damning than any paparazzi photo. Can a monarchy rooted in duty coexist with members who traded their titles for Hollywood contracts? This is the story of how Princess Anne, long regarded as the hardest-working yet most underappreciated royal, has become the monarchy's unlikely sword and shield. It's about how her loyalty to the crown has evolved into something far more potent, a mission to save the institution by cutting out what she perceives as its most dangerous infection. Over the course of this investigation, we'll unearth the private meetings, the brutal behind-the-scenes conversations, the subtle yet symbolic gestures, from seating chart revisions to patronage removals. And we'll follow the growing chasm between the House of Windsor and the House of Montecito. We'll dive deep into the battle lines being drawn not just on official royal schedules, but in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, where decisions made in whispers carry the weight of national consequence. Let's be clear, the stakes are not theoretical. They are existential. King Charles faces a leadership crisis more delicate and volatile than any he imagined when he ascended the throne after Queen Elizabeth II's passing. He is not just navigating global diplomacy or environmental reform. He is not just the ceremonial head of state. He is now being forced to choose between keeping the peace within his fractured family or salvaging the public's respect for a monarchy that appears more vulnerable by the day. And Princess Anne, his only sister and perhaps the only royal immune to modern scandal, is done watching from the sidelines. To understand how we arrived here, we must revisit the chain of decisions that drove the Sussexes away from the UK and into the warm embrace of California's media ecosystem. At first, their departure was framed as an attempt at personal freedom, a step back from the glare of the British press. But over time, their actions became less about retreat and more about redefinition. Deals with Spotify and Netflix, highly produced documentaries, public criticism of unnamed royal family members, a memoir that pulled no punches, and most recently, whispers that Meghan was eyeing political office in the United States. To many, including Princess Anne, this wasn't reinvention. This was betrayal. The tension between service and self-promotion lies at the heart of what Anne calls the irreconcilable contradiction of the Sussexes' role. You cannot claim to be royal, she has allegedly said to staff, and then sell your version of royalty to the highest bidder. And for Anne, that contradiction isn't merely inconvenient. It's intolerable. Palace insiders describe a royal family operating on two time zones, one of protocol and heritage, and another of celebrity and disruption, and has made it her mission to bring that duality to an end, with clarity, finality, and, some say, vengeance. She's not interested in Instagram photos or public sympathy polls. She's interested in duty, lineage, and the legacy left behind by her mother, Queen Elizabeth II, a woman who understood the monarchy as something greater than any individual, greater even than any scandal, and intends to uphold that legacy. even if it means removing her own nephew and his wife from the royal fabric completely. So how does one go about dismantling a prince? Not with brute force, not with angry interviews or exposés. No, and operates differently. Coldly. Strategically. Royal courtiers have begun using a term in private, the Iron Veil. It refers to how and executes her influence. No screaming, no media, no chaos. Just controlled measures. A pulled invitation here. A changed seating arrangement there. A closed door. A quiet freeze. And yet, these measures add up. The Sussexes have been moved further and further from royal affairs. Their patronage is stripped. Their security arrangements reevaluated. Invitations rescinded or lost in the mail. There is no official exile. No public declaration. Only the unmistakable chill of institutional abandonment, an abandonment spearheaded by Princess and with precision and resolve. But what about King Charles? Why hasn't he stopped her? Why hasn't he stepped in to protect his youngest son? That's the question that will haunt this entire saga. Some insiders believe Charles still harbors hope for reconciliation. Others say he's torn between his love for Harry and his responsibility to protect the throne. Still others believe Anne's influence has now eclipsed even Camilla's when it comes to palace affairs, that in the wake of mounting health concerns and public pressure, Charles is leaning on and more than ever. One thing is clear, Princess isn't issuing empty threats. She's enacting a plan. And her endgame is not just containment. It's elimination from public image, from royal ceremony, from the very infrastructure of the Windsor future. Over the next chapters, we'll expose the critical turning points in this escalating war. The quiet power alliances forged behind palace walls. The code words used in palace documentation to signal exclusion. The conversations between Anne and William that may ultimately reshape the line of succession. We'll even examine the role of the late Queen, and how her private final instructions may have lit the fuse and is now determined to ignite. This is not the story of a sibling quarrel. This is the story of a constitutional house fight. This is the line in the sand. And at the center stands Princess and silent, stoic, unyielding, making one thing abundantly clear. The future of the crown has no room for the Sussex brand. Are you ready to see how far she's willing to go? We'll trace Princess Anne's personal transformation, her deep roots in tradition, and how decades of silent loyalty evolved into bold internal rebellion to defend the monarchy from the perceived threat of the Sussexes. Let's begin. From duty to defiance, Anne's royal evolution. For most of her life, Princess Anne was never seen as a revolutionary figure. She was the quiet one, the tireless one, the unfailingly dutiful royal who moved across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth like a ghost in a well-tailored coat, shaking hands, opening schools, visiting hospitals, cutting ribbons, and never once stepping out of line. She wasn't flashy like Diana. She wasn't controversial like Andrew. She wasn't ambitious like Charles. And she certainly wasn't rebellious like Harry. And was steady, a machine of monarchy, clocking more engagements per year than any other royal, often with little to no fanfare. But beneath that stoic exterior lay a mind as sharp as any strategist's, a will harder than granite, and a personal code that, once tested, would reveal a surprising capacity for defiance, especially when she perceived that the very institution she had devoted her life to was under siege, not from foreign enemies, but from within. To understand how Princess Anne evolved from the royal family's quiet workhorse into one of its most assertive protectors, you must return to her earliest days. Born in 1950, Anne was the second child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Unlike her older brother Charles, Anne was never groomed for the throne. But from a young age, she was taught something just as important, that the monarchy is a machine that only survives through duty, not drama. That message was etched into her consciousness by her father, a man known for his strict discipline and sense of service. Prince Philip had always been a commanding figure in Anne's life, and where Charles absorbed Philip's sharpness and Elizabeth's restraint, and seemed to inherit Philip's entire personality in miniature. She was no-nonsense, practical, and completely uninterested in emotional pageantry. By the time she was a teenager, she had already begun shaping a royal persona that would define her for decades, one of purpose without performance. While her siblings often made headlines for the wrong reasons and stayed beneath the radar, her 1973 marriage to Captain Mark Phillips was conducted with far less media spectacle than Charles's wedding to Diana years later. She refused royal titles for her children, Peter and Zara, believing they should live as close to ordinary lives as possible. She took up competitive equestrian sports and became the first British royal to compete in the Olympics. And through it all, she kept up a relentless pace of royal work that surpassed all of her siblings, even into her 60s and 70s. What made an exceptional was not her glamour, but her grind. In a monarchy often accused of being outdated and out of touch, she became the embodiment of quiet relevance. You wouldn't see her giving emotional interviews, but she would be in flood zones, food banks, and farming expos. You wouldn't catch her on the cover of glossy magazines, but you would see her, clipboard in hand, at community centers in towns most of Britain's elite couldn't point to on a map. Yet, for all her service, and was also underestimated. She never sought attention, so attention rarely came. The British press mostly left her alone, not because she wasn't interesting, but because she wasn't interested in being a celebrity. In a family increasingly split between royal duty and media magnetism, and firmly chose the former. But it was precisely that invisibility that allowed her to become the family's hidden force. Insiders say that for decades, and quietly influenced key decisions behind the scenes. She would never publicly contradict the monarch, but she had private audiences with the Queen that carried weight. She was consulted on Commonwealth issues, trusted with controversial charity assignments, deployed to regions that were politically delicate. In many ways, she was the royal family's fixer, the one you sent when you wanted results, not headlines. But something shifted in and after the 2020 Sussex departure. When Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping down as senior royals, it shook the House of Windsor. Not simply because of the exit itself, or royals had stepped back before, but because of the way it was done. The press release. The social media announcement. The absence of deference to the Queen. The unilateral tone. The commercial ambitions that followed. To Princess, and this wasn't a transition. It was a rupture. Sources close to the palace say, and was livid behind closed doors. She viewed the Sussexes' decision as a betrayal of everything the monarchy stood for, and more personally, everything she had spent her life defending. While other royals, including Charles, attempted to cushion the blow with language of understanding and saw no such gray areas. You're either in the institution or you're not. You don't get to be royal when it's convenient and celebrity when it pays. She is said to have described the exit as a catastrophic breach during a private family briefing. And more importantly, she began to act on that opinion, not publicly, but operationally. Her influence on scheduling decisions grew. She began advocating for a reorganization of royal duties that would remove ambiguity. Royals either served the crown, or they didn't, and those who didn't should no longer be afforded the privileges, protections, or symbolic positions of those who did. This hardline stance didn't come out of nowhere. It was decades in the making. You see, and had watched this movie before. She had seen royal indulgence and leniency lead to institutional embarrassment. Prince Andrew's scandals. Charles's turbulent divorce. Fergie's toe-sucking headlines. Diana's televised interviews. Through it all, she had remained silent, but not blind. Now, watching the Sussexes transform their royal connections into entertainment branding, and decided that silence was no longer an option. Her evolution from dutiful operator to internal enforcer didn't involve grand speeches or policy statements. It involved movement, appointments, omissions, and began maneuvering herself physically closer to the king at state events, a subtle but unmistakable sign of rising influence. She held more joint appearances with Prince William, increasingly seen as a symbolic show of solidarity with the heir. She reportedly hosted informal strategy dinners at Gackham Park, inviting select staff and senior royals to map out a new internal code, one that removed ambiguity about who was truly royal. But perhaps the most striking element of Anne's transformation was her shift from reaction to initiation. Rather than merely responding to palace crises, Anne began to anticipate and preempt them. When reports surfaced that Meghan was exploring a return to the UK for charitable work under the Sussex title, Anne's office allegedly intervened to block any appearance that could be construed as royal endorsement. When Harry reached out about participating in the Invictus Games under the royal banner, Anne's allies quietly suggested he not involve Windsor branding, a suggestion that soon became a requirement. In essence, Anne was building a firewall. A firewall between the monarchy's official structure and the brand machine that Harry and Meghan had become. And she wasn't doing it for herself. She was doing it, she believed, for the future of the crown. This shift has unsettled even longtime royal advisors. Some whisper that Anne is overstepping. Others see her as the last adult in the room. One aide described her as Elizabeth's spirit with Philip's spine. Whatever side they fall on, few deny that, and is now a central force shaping royal policy, not in theory, but in practice. The media has begun to take notice too. Editorials that once overlooked her now refer to and as the monarchy's quiet power. Royal watchers who spent years fixated on Diana or Meghan now find themselves dissecting and schedule her body language, her placement next to Charles. Every appearance now matters. Every comment is interpreted. She has become, without asking for it, the monarchy's moral compass. And as her power has grown, so has her defiance, not loud, not theatrical, but unmistakably firm. She does not smile when asked about the Sussexes. She does not speak in platitudes when asked about modernity. She speaks in absolutes. The crown must be protected. Protocol matters. Titles are earned, not retained through tabloid wars and streaming deals. Some call her old-fashioned. Others call her the monarchy's last realist. Either way, Princess Anne has crossed a line, not by leaving the royal family, but by asserting that others must. And as we move forward in this story, the consequences of that assertion will become impossible to ignore. The woman once known for being silent in service is now speaking through action. And she's not backing down. This section will explore the ripple effect of Harry and Meghan's Oprah Winfrey interview inside royal walls, focusing especially on how it galvanized Princess Anne, intensified divides, and reshaped internal dynamics at the palace. Let's begin. Mounting tensions, the private fallout after the Oprah interview. It was a crisp Sunday evening in March 2021 when households around the world tuned in to what would become one of the most explosive televised interviews in modern royal history. In a secluded Californian garden, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle sat down with Oprah Winfrey and dropped bombshell after bombshell. Accusations of racism, claims of royal neglect, mental health struggles, and a depiction of life behind palace gates that felt more like a gilded prison than the institution of national service many imagined it to be. For millions of viewers, it was captivating television. For Buckingham Palace, it was an emergency. And for Princess Anne, it was the beginning of the end. Within hours of the broadcast, royal insiders reported that palace corridors fell into a stunned silence. Not because criticism of the monarchy was new. The institution had weathered storms before. But because of the unprecedented nature of the allegations and the timing. The Queen was nearing her twilight years. Prince Philip was gravely ill. Prince Charles had just begun tentatively shaping his post-Elizabethan vision. The last thing the firm needed was an all-out public relations detonation. And yet, that's exactly what they got. But among all the reactions inside the palace, the frantic calls from press secretaries, the whispers of damage control, the worried glances between courtiers, none were as unwaveringly furious as that of Princess Anne. According to multiple well-placed sources, Anne watched the interview not out of curiosity, but obligation. She wanted to hear it directly. No filtered summaries. No palace briefings. Just Meghan and Harry's own words. And as the 2-hour interview progressed, Anne's expression reportedly hardened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't cry. She didn't take notes. But when it was over, she allegedly stood up, left the room, and said nothing to anyone for several hours. What happened next was not theatrical, it was calculated. By the next morning, senior palace aides were called into an early meeting. While King Charles and the Queen were already being advised on drafting a public response, and took her own route. She didn't want to speak to the media. She wanted to speak to the king. She reportedly demanded a private audience with her brother and laid out, point by point, her response to the Sussexes' allegations. Anne's position was direct and unsentimental. She didn't believe the accusations were entirely without basis. Even she acknowledged that the palace had, for too long, remained behind the curve when it came to issues of race, diversity, and mental health. But what enraged her was the method, the decision to air private family grievances to the world, in what she saw as a self-serving spectacle. To Anne, loyalty wasn't optional. It was the price of belonging. And what Meghan and Harry had done wasn't courageous, it was treacherous. She is said to have told Charles, in sharp and unmistakable terms, that a line had been crossed. One that could not simply be forgiven with apologies or public relations gloss. They've declared war, she reportedly said, and we're still pretending it's a family disagreement. It was in that conversation that the foundation for Anne's hardened stance began to take form. Unlike Charles, who has long been torn between paternal instinct and institutional duty and had no such inner conflict. She wasn't Harry's father. She didn't raise him. She respected him, even cared for him in the abstract sense, but her loyalty was to the monarchy, not to her nephew. And that loyalty demanded action. Internally, she began rallying support from like-minded courtiers and royals. The Queen, though deeply saddened, remained above the fray in public. William, already angered by his brother's actions, became an ally in quiet meetings. And Camilla, while careful not to be too vocal, reportedly supported his instincts. She too had been targeted, albeit indirectly, in the interview. But what Anne did next was more significant than any angry conversation or palace memo. She started cutting them off slowly, methodically, and without noise. First came the distancing of joint charitable appearances. Any event remotely linked to the Sussexes was removed from Anne's schedule. Then came the closed-door meetings about patronage reassignment. And, now increasingly consulted as an institutional anchor, made it clear organizations previously held by Harry and Meghan should not revert to them under any form, not even honorary. Her belief was simple. They had relinquished their positions. They should not be allowed to reclaim influence under a hybrid model. Her language reportedly grew even sharper in private. In one staff briefing, she is said to have warned, "They don't just want their own path. They want our platform to walk it on." It wasn't just that Anne viewed the Sussexes as disloyal. She viewed them as dangerous. The Oprah interview had triggered an avalanche, not just of public opinion, but of internal scrutiny, and began re-examining every policy, every symbolic gesture, every lingering tie that still linked the Sussexes to royal influence. She wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in severance. What made her actions even more impactful was how she communicated them, and did not leak. She did not speak to friendly reporters. She did not give anonymous quotes. She moved through internal channels with the authority of a general, precise, silent, and undeniable. Behind the scenes, and began formalizing her belief in a doctrine many now refer to as the doctrine of service. It was based on a core principle: royal privilege must be earned through active service, not simply inherited or retained as a branding tool. Under this doctrine, the Sussexes, who had stepped away from active duty, no longer qualified for any form of elevated access, ceremonial role, or title-based leverage. And slowly, her doctrine began to influence actual policy. The Royal Rota system, which governs press access to royal engagements, began excluding the Sussexes' activities from its official calendar. Their images were removed from certain charity banners. Royal commemorative materials, programs, calendars, documents stopped featuring the Sussexes' likenesses or names unless absolutely necessary. It was the beginning of a quiet erasure, executed without press releases but felt in every corner of the institution. Yet perhaps the most pivotal moment came not from policy, but from posture. A few months after the Oprah interview, the royal family gathered for the funeral of Prince Philip. It was the first time Harry had returned to the UK since the interview aired. All eyes were on him. Would there be an olive branch? A handshake? A whisper of forgiveness? What happened instead was symbolic and definitive. While other royals offered cool but civil interactions and reportedly refused any direct conversation, she kept her gaze elsewhere, her movements deliberate, her body language frozen. According to royal aides present at the event, Anne's message was clear. No words were necessary. The silence was the statement. In the months that followed, Anne only deepened her stance. When asked in a closed royal strategy meeting how to navigate future Sussex interactions, she allegedly replied, "There will be no future Sussex interactions, not as royals." That singular line has since become a defining mantra of the internal shift within the monarchy. The fallout from the Oprah interview also led Anne to reevaluate the Queen's long-held ethos of never complain, never explain. While she respected her mother's philosophy and recognized that in the age of media manipulation and global platforms, silence could sometimes be interpreted as guilt, but instead of advocating for public rebuttals and pushed for structural ones. The way to fight false narratives, she believed, was not through headlines, but through decisive institutional change. She began supporting a review of all security arrangements, especially those involving Sussex international travel. She lobbied against the inclusion of the Sussexes in the official order of precedence at state events. And in one now famous private discussion with royal aides, and asked, "If they no longer walk with us, Why should they walk among us? It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a warning. Because the issue was no longer just about personal betrayal or public embarrassment. It was about the survival of an institution. The Oprah interview had pierced the armor of the monarchy in a way few events had. And if not countered and feared, it could trigger a long-term erosion of royal legitimacy, especially among younger generations. She wasn't alone in this fear. Public trust in the monarchy dipped temporarily in the months following the interview. Polls showed significant shifts, particularly among millennials and Gen Z. And while the Queen's response, a brief but measured statement, helped stabilize the narrative, the undercurrent of doubt remained, and wanted that doubt extinguished. Her vision for doing so wasn't rooted in PR strategies or influencer campaigns. It was rooted in discipline, consistency, a return to formality. In the years following the interview, and began assuming more visible roles, not just out of duty, but as a counterbalance. Every ribbon she cut, every medal she pinned, every town she visited, it was all part of a broader campaign to reassert what royalty was meant to represent, service over spotlight. And the public noticed. While Harry and Meghan's popularity saw fluctuations, rising among American audiences, dipping in the UK, and's reputation surged. She was seen as authentic, no nonsense, and immune to the scandals that plagued her family. More importantly, she was increasingly seen as the embodiment of everything the monarchy needed to survive: stoicism, duty, and quiet strength. That strength is now the foundation upon which and is waging her campaign. The Oprah interview was not just an inflection point. It was, in Anne's mind, a declaration of war. And she intends to win. This section delves into the high-stakes private confrontation between Princess Anne and King Charles, the context behind Anne's now infamous ultimatum, and how this pivotal moment triggered a shift in the monarchy's internal alignment. Let's begin. The ultimatum. It's them or the crown. The walls of Sandringham House have stood for over 150 years, bearing silent witness to royal triumphs, family crises, and political upheaval. But on a quiet winter evening in late 2023, it became the stage for what many royal insiders now describe as the moment the monarchy reached its internal breaking point. At the center of it all was a woman who had never sought the spotlight, but who now stood at the edge of a constitutional cliff, ready to draw the line with the most powerful man in the kingdom. Her own brother. Princess Anne had never staged a confrontation like this before. Not with her father, not with her mother, and certainly not with her elder brother. But enough was enough. She had waited. She had watched. She had remained silent as scandal after scandal chipped away at the foundations of the Windsor dynasty. But after the Oprah interview, the streaming deals, the tell-all memoirs, and the persistent attempts by Harry and Meghan to retain symbolic ties to the institution they had publicly disavowed, and believed the moment had come. It was time to choose. And so, she delivered her chilling ultimatum. It's them or the crown. This wasn't just a sister challenging her brother. This was the crown's oldest foot soldier standing in front of the sovereign, demanding that he protect what they had spent their entire lives upholding. According to royal sources familiar with the conversation, it wasn't requested. It was demanded. And reportedly summoned Charles to a private chamber at Sandringham, away from aides, away from press officers, and away from even the Queen consort. It was just the two of them, face to face, in a room thick with decades of shared history. And didn't mince words. She began by laying out what she called a timeline of decay, marking the key incidents that had steadily eroded public confidence in the monarchy. She reminded Charles of the PR disaster caused by the Oprah interview. The leaks. The half-denials. The reports that Meghan was planning a second memoir. The public confusion over whether Harry and Meghan were in or out of the royal fold. The emotional toll on the Queen in her final years. The simmering anger of Prince William. The exhaustion of staff who felt under siege. The optics, the consequences, the chaos. Then she turned personal. "You're the king now," she reportedly told him. "There is no room for hesitation. There is no room for sentimentality. This is about the survival of the crown, and you must decide whether you're going to protect it or let it rot." Charles, according to those familiar with the exchange, was taken aback not by the substance of her argument, but by the sharpness of her delivery. And, known for her quiet discipline, had transformed into something else entirely. Not emotional, not angry, but absolute. She was no longer offering advice. She was issuing a demand. She made it clear that if Charles failed to take decisive action to fully sever Harry and Meghan from all remaining royal privileges, titles, ceremonial invitations, access to royal estates, inclusion in events, or communications with active members, then he would not only weaken the monarchy, he would lose her support. It was an astonishing threat coming from someone like Anne. She was not a rebel. She had never questioned the line of succession. She had accepted her place in the shadow of her older brother and her nephews without complaint. But now, she was signaling something radical, that she would no longer stand by if the crown itself was compromised. According to two longtime royal aides, Anne said the following phrase with steely precision: "If you can't defend the throne, then stop sitting on it." The implications of that statement reverberated throughout the palace. What Anne had essentially done was issue a constitutional warning. If the king allowed emotion to override structure, if he allowed familial guilt to contaminate royal integrity, then he would undermine the very reason the monarchy exists, as a symbol of national stability, discipline, and unity. She wasn't threatening abdication. She wasn't threatening scandal. She was threatening indifference, the one thing the monarchy cannot afford from its most devoted member. For Charles, the ultimatum struck at the heart of his deepest internal conflict. He had always been a man of dual instincts, torn between the obligations of state and the emotional weight of fatherhood. Even as king, Charles had continued to hope for some form of reconciliation with Harry. He had encouraged the idea that time would heal wounds. He had floated proposals for limited roles for the Sussexes in future Commonwealth initiatives. He had asked aides to maintain polite correspondence with the couple through private channels. But Anne's words shattered that illusion. There would be no halfway, no hybrid model, no ceremonial inclusion without consequence. In that moment, Charles realized he wasn't just being asked to choose between his son and his sister. He was being asked to choose between the family he loved and the crown he had sworn to uphold. And the pressure wasn't just coming from Anne. Prince William had already made it known that he had no desire to work alongside the Sussexes again in any capacity. Camilla, still stung by old accusations and misrepresentations, had privately encouraged Charles to distance himself from them. Senior aides had begun urging the palace to clarify the Sussexes' position for the sake of public perception. And now, within drawing a line in the sand, Charles was left with no more excuses. But Anne wasn't done. She reportedly outlined a multi-stage plan, a blueprint, really, for how the severance should be carried out. It included a formal update to the royal family's internal order of precedence, removing Harry and Meghan from all ceremonial positions and hereditary associations, a full audit of any remaining joint patronages or shared titles, with recommendations for redistribution to working royals, a review of security arrangements and travel privileges for the Sussexes when visiting the UK, a total freeze on royal communications with any external projects linked to Archewell or related Sussex enterprises, a symbolic but public gesture of distancing, such as the reorganization of the royal seating arrangement at the next major royal event. She concluded, reportedly, with a chilling prophecy: "If we don't act now, we'll be dealing with the collapse of public trust later. You may not see it yet, but the people do. And they will not follow a family that cannot govern itself." What made Anne's ultimatum so potent was not just her position or her passion. It was her track record. Unlike other royals, Anne had nothing to prove. No scandals. No ambition for higher office. No interest in media attention. She had served the monarchy for over 50 years with military-like efficiency. She had outworked every sibling and cousin. She had been loyal when others faltered. When she spoke, it wasn't out of envy or rivalry. It was out of institutional clarity. The palace aides present that week later described the days following her ultimatum as unusually tense. Charles withdrew from most non-essential meetings. He took long walks around the estate. He avoided the press. And most tellingly, he postponed a previously scheduled call with Harry. For Anne, the delay was confirmation of everything she feared: indecision, weakness, a refusal to confront reality. And yet, slowly, quietly, signs began to emerge that Charles had listened. A planned Sussex return visit to the UK was abruptly, indefinitely postponed. A subtle change to the official royal website demoted the Sussexes' profiles further down the list. Communications from Buckingham Palace began using colder, more formal language when referring to the Duke and Duchess. And the most visible shift came weeks later, at a major state event, when Princess Anne stood directly at the King's right hand, and the Sussexes were nowhere to be seen. For the public, these changes seemed minor. For the institution, they were tectonic. It marked the beginning of a new doctrine, one not announced through proclamations or constitutional declarations, but through subtle, unyielding recalibration. A doctrine where loyalty was no longer assumed, and where betrayal would be met not with rage, but with erasure. The ultimatum had worked, and had forced the crown to defend itself. She had made the king face a truth too painful to accept on his own. And in doing so, she had crossed a line that no other royal had dared approach. She had chosen the crown, over family, over emotion, over history. And in doing so, she had redefined the monarchy's future. This section explores how changes in seating arrangements at royal events have silently yet powerfully communicated the internal shifts within the monarchy, especially Princess Anne's elevation and the Sussexes' calculated demotion. We will uncover the significance behind every chair, angle, and protocol, revealing the silent war being waged through symbolism. Let's begin. The royal row reassigned, seating chart symbolism. The British monarchy has always understood the power of silence, of appearances, body language, proximity, and positioning. Unlike elected governments that speak through legislation and speeches, royalty communicates through ritual, tradition, and symbolism. And perhaps nowhere is that more evident than in the delicate, strategic arrangement of seating during official royal events. In the aftermath of Princess Anne's ultimatum and King Charles's reluctant but visible shift toward distancing the Sussexes, subtle changes began surfacing in places most of the public rarely thought to look: on the royal seating chart. What seemed like a simple logistical decision, who sits where at a funeral, a state banquet, or a jubilee, quickly turned into a clear language of power, punishment, and precedence. For those fluent in royal protocol, each adjustment screamed volumes. To the casual observer, it may have looked like formality. To insiders, it was a reconfiguration of the monarchy's soul. The most discussed and dissected example of this came during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations in 2022, Queen Elizabeth II's last major public event before her death. The world was watching, hoping for signs of unity. After months of tension, Meghan and Harry's attendance was seen as a potential olive branch, a chance to reset. Instead, what played out on camera was perhaps the most brutal display of institutional coldness since Edward VIII was ostracized for abdication. As the Queen took her place on the Buckingham Palace balcony, surrounded by working royals, the Sussexes were nowhere in sight. They were not invited to stand beside the monarch. Instead, they watched from the sidelines, positioned behind senior aides, distant cousins, and low-ranking household members. In terms of precedence, it was a demotion of staggering symbolism. And it didn't stop there. During the National Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral, cameras panned to the Sussexes sitting several rows back, separated from Prince William, Kate Middleton, and even Princess Anne. Gone were the front-row seats they once held. Gone was the spotlight. Instead, they were relegated to what one royal correspondent described as polite obscurity. The most telling moment? As the royals filed into the cathedral, Princess Anne walked directly in front of the Sussexes without so much as a glance in their direction. Her posture was composed, her expression blank, but her message was unmistakable. They were no longer part of the inner sanctum. What many viewers didn't know is that these seating decisions are never random. They are overseen by the Earl Marshal's office and the Lord Chamberlain's department, often in consultation with the sovereign and his most senior aides. Every placement reflects rank, relevance, and institutional favor. And in recent years, those placements have increasingly told a tale of two royal futures, one being ascended and the other quietly erased. Behind the scenes, Princess Anne had begun to play a more direct role in influencing these seating configurations. Sources close to the palace reveal that she advocated for stricter adherence to the working royal policy, an internal doctrine that prioritized those who remained active in royal duties over those who stepped back. Under this lens, and pushed to ensure that public-facing events would reflect the true structure of the monarchy, not emotional ties or historical memory, but active engagement. At events such as the Commonwealth Day service, Princess Anne was now consistently positioned beside or directly behind King Charles, not just as a courtesy to her seniority, but as a symbolic reinforcement of her growing role. Meghan and Harry, when present, were often placed further back, with minimal camera exposure. This was no accident. It was Anne's doctrine made visible, that royal privilege must match royal participation. The reassignments were even more glaring during private dinners, official portraits, and post-coronation receptions. for the first time in decades, and appeared in more promotional materials than the Sussexes. Her seating beside Charles at the Garter Day luncheon, previously considered a formality, was now viewed as part of a deliberate public reframing of the royal hierarchy. Even in the palace's Christmas broadcasts and family group photos, the Sussexes' absence wasn't just noted, it was emphasized. In one carefully curated image, Charles and Camilla stood flanked by William, Kate, their children, and Princess Anne. The message was subtle but strategic. This was the core of the modern monarchy, streamlined, traditional, and uncontested. And yet, it wasn't only the Sussexes who took notice. Foreign dignitaries, diplomatic staff, and royal watchers across the globe began recalibrating their protocols when engaging with the royal family. At a UN reception in New York, where Meghan and Harry were previously expected to play soft power roles, British officials shifted their focus instead to and William. Invitations once extended to Harry and Meghan were quietly rerouted. Even Commonwealth nations, long influenced by appearances of unity, began to regard the Sussexes as informal actors, no longer central to the institution's identity. Inside the palace, staff began adjusting everything from motorcade lineups to seating at briefings. Anne's physical positioning in meetings, travel, and state affairs now mirrored her unofficial title among insiders, the Shield. She was not simply next to the king. She was defending the institution with her presence. Every chair pulled out for her was another reminder that service, not sentiment, governed protocol. But the most damning seating shift occurred during the king's first state banquet at Buckingham Palace following his coronation. It was meant to be a celebration of continuity of Charles's vision for a streamlined, modernized monarchy. The guest list was heavily scrutinized. The media coverage was expansive, and when the official seating chart was leaked, it sent shockwaves through royal circles. Not only were Harry and Meghan absent, they had not even been invited, but sat at the king's right hand, a position traditionally reserved for the Queen or the Prince of Wales. On the left, Camilla. Across the table, William and Catherine. The alignment was unmistakable. It formed a visual triangle of power, Charles at the head, flanked by the two women now most trusted with defending the monarchy's continuity and image, the Queen Consort and the Princess Royal. The signal was clear. The royal row had been reassigned. What once was a symbol of lineage and birthright had become a message of alignment and loyalty. Chairs weren't just furniture. They were judgment, recognition, reward, or rebuke. The fallout from these decisions continues to ripple. In Montecito, insiders say Meghan took the seating exclusions as personal humiliation. During a private gathering with Netflix executives, she reportedly referenced the Jubilee snub as a coordinated message to shame us publicly. Harry, by contrast, was reportedly crushed but resigned. They've closed the door, he's said to have confided to a friend. And we're not getting back in. But Anne's position has not softened. In fact, she has doubled down. In one off-the-record comment to an aide after the coronation seating arrangement was finalized, and allegedly stated, "Symbolism is what we're left with when trust is gone. So we'd better use it well." Those words now echo throughout the institution. For an outsider, it may seem like overinterpretation. Too much meaning placed on who sits next to whom. But within the monarchy, where words are often withheld, and actions tightly choreographed, seating is power. Seating is story. Seating is verdict. And Princess Anne has made sure the verdict is unmistakable. The crown has spoken, and its message sits quietly in the front row, eyes forward, unblinking. This section focuses on King Charles's internal conflict, the emotional weight of being a father pulled toward a son in distress, while also being a monarch pressured by his sister and the institution to act decisively. Let's begin. Charles's dilemma, between a sister's warning and a son's desperation. The throne is a gilded cage. It commands reverence and prestige, but it also requires sacrifice of privacy, of vulnerability, and, in some cases, of personal bonds. For King Charles III, no burden has exemplified this cruel exchange more than the battle between his duty as sovereign and his heart as a father. By late 2023, the pressure on Charles had reached an unbearable crescendo. On one side stood his sister, Princess Anne, unflinching in her demand that the monarchy defend itself against the ongoing disruption caused by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. On the other stood his youngest son, not only estranged but emotionally deteriorating under the public fallout of his decisions and the cold isolation enforced by the palace. Caught between the two was the institution itself, thousands of years of royal tradition, a fragile Commonwealth unity, and a British public watching closely for signs of strength or surrender. What haunted Charles most was that this wasn't just a political dilemma. It was deeply, painfully personal. He had always had a complicated relationship with both of his sons, shaped by duty, guilt, and generational friction. With William, Charles saw the continuity of the crown, the dutiful heir molded by protocol. With Harry, he saw something else. The fire of Diana, the emotion, the wounded child whose trauma had been exacerbated, not soothed, by palace walls. Even after Harry's break from royal duties and his decision to publicly criticize the institution, Charles hadn't entirely closed the door. Behind palace walls, he maintained a fragile, almost tortured hope that reconciliation was still possible. That, in time, Harry would realize the damage caused, and they could somehow salvage a relationship from the wreckage. But Anne's ultimatum had changed everything. It's them or the crown, she'd warned him, and he knew she wasn't bluffing. She had the respect of the entire royal apparatus. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her actions would speak for her. If Charles faltered, if he failed to act decisively, he wouldn't just lose Anne's cooperation, he might lose the confidence of the institution he had waited his entire life to lead. And yet, Charles could not bring himself to sever ties completely. Not yet. Privately, Charles continued to speak with Harry in infrequent but emotionally charged phone calls. According to insiders, these calls were often initiated by Harry, sometimes in anger, sometimes in desperation, occasionally with the brittle optimism of a son longing for connection. In one conversation, reportedly occurring weeks after Anne's meeting with Charles, Harry told his father, "You're letting them erase me." The words pierced Charles. Erasure. The same tactic that Anne had orchestrated. The same consequence that Harry had begun to feel firsthand, being omitted from photos, left off of ceremonial guest lists, and repositioned in the public eye as something akin to an outsider. For Charles, the situation felt like a slow-motion collapse of everything he had tried to protect: his family, his legacy, his reign. He confided in close aides that he felt boxed in by loyalty. Loyalty to the crown. Loyalty to Anne. Loyalty to his late mother's vision of stability. And yet, within all those competing loyalties, there was very little room left for what he truly felt. That tension only grew sharper when reports surfaced that Harry was planning to release a follow-up project tied to his memoir, a documentary or series that would delve deeper into his version of royal life, with more footage, more commentary, and potentially new revelations about Charles's role during his childhood. The palace went into panic mode. Charles, stunned, felt betrayed all over again. But even then, he resisted calls to retaliate. And Camilla and William reportedly confronted him in a private meeting shortly afterward. According to palace aides with knowledge of that conversation, the tone was serious, even confrontational. William, already beyond the point of reconciliation, warned Charles that the monarchy could not continue to operate under the constant threat of Harry's next media move, and was more direct. "Every time you hesitate," she said, "you give them oxygen." Camilla, more measured but equally firm, added that public support for the monarchy was directly tied to clarity. The longer the Sussex situation remained unresolved, the more it fed speculation, division, and scandal. And yet, Charles still hesitated. His heart was not so easily hardened. He knew what it meant to be isolated. He had lived under the glare of the media for decades. He had watched his own character destroyed and rebuilt by public opinion more than once. And in Harry, he recognized something deeply familiar, a man trying to survive within the very machine that had crushed his mother. But Charles also recognized something dangerous. Harry had turned that pain into a platform, and Meghan had turned that platform into a brand. Together, they had become a disruptive force not just outside the royal circle, but inside it. Using emotional narrative, selective memory, and media leverage to challenge the very framework of monarchy that Charles had inherited. It was a threat unlike any other. Anne saw it clearly. At one point, and reportedly said, "This isn't about parenting anymore. This is about precedent." She was right. If Charles allowed Harry and Meghan to remain in limbo, not fully royal, but not fully removed, it would establish a dangerous precedent for future generations. Royalty could become transactional. Titles could become marketing tools. Service could be decoupled from privilege. For Charles, this was the heart of the dilemma. He was being asked to choose between saving his son or saving the monarchy. He knew that choosing the latter would devastate Harry. But choosing the former might destroy the very institution he had vowed to preserve. In the weeks that followed Anne's intervention, Charles began to change. Not publicly, not all at once, but there were signs. Fewer calls to Montecito, less interest in negotiating roles or appearances, more alignment with William and Anne's positions. His public remarks, once tinged with fatherly ambiguity, now became more measured, more institutional. And then came the final confirmation. Charles formally approved the removal of the Sussexes from the list of royals entitled to ceremonial precedence. It wasn't announced in a press release. It wasn't dramatized. It was done the royal way, silently, through protocol. A revised internal document from the Lord Chamberlain's office circulated to senior courtiers. It restructured how royals would be presented at events moving forward. The Sussexes were no longer listed among senior participants. Their names appeared near the bottom, technically included, but with no roles, no duties, no function. It was Charles's quiet declaration, a signal to Anne, a message to William, a painful whisper to Harry. He had made his choice, and yet it haunted him. Friends of the king say he grew more withdrawn in the months that followed. He took longer walks alone. He became more reflective. He asked aides for more updates on Harry's well-being, not his actions, but his well-being. And when the Queen's death anniversary came around, Charles reportedly lit a candle for her and placed a second one next to it, without explanation. Some believe it was for Diana. Others believe it was for Harry, the son he loved but could no longer protect. The dilemma hadn't disappeared. It had only evolved. Charles had done what the monarchy required. He had acted in defense of the institution. But in doing so, he had widened the chasm between father and son, a rift that may never fully close. And, for her part, did not gloat. She had no interest in winning. Her interest was preservation. And in Charles, she saw both the cost of leadership and the agony of fatherhood. In one of the few documented conversations between them after the formal seating reshuffle, Anne reportedly placed a hand on her brother's arm and said, "You did what you had to do. But I know it broke you." Charles said nothing. But the silence spoke volumes. The battle of public image. Anne's quiet strength versus Meghan's PR machine. Target word count, at least 2,500 words. This section explores how Princess Anne and Meghan Markle represent two fundamentally different approaches to public influence, institutional power, and brand identity, one steeped in quiet resilience and earned respect. The other built on media mastery, emotional storytelling, and modern visibility. Their clash isn't only private. It's also a war for hearts and minds in the court of global opinion. Let's begin. The battle of public image, Anne's quiet strength versus Meghan's PR machine. In an era where image can wield more influence than action, and where celebrity often overshadows tradition, the British monarchy has found itself pulled in two sharply contrasting directions, embodied, ironically, by two women from entirely different worlds. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, who has spent decades immersed in service, diplomacy, and understated public duty. And Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, who, since entering royal life, has leveraged a powerful blend of personal narrative, modern media, and celebrity influence to shape her place in the public eye. Both women have drawn attention. Both have sparked headlines. But their strategies, their values, and their methods of communication could not be more opposed. And the collision between the two has revealed a deeper philosophical divide, not just about royalty, but about what influence and leadership look like in the 21st century. And never sought the camera. Meghan mastered it and avoided the spotlight. Meghan learned to command it and built trust over decades, one engagement at a time. Meghan built global curiosity in weeks, using authenticity, vulnerability, and spectacle to captivate millions. This wasn't just a generational gap. It was a clash of ideologies, and it would come to define one of the monarchy's most consequential power struggles in recent history. To understand the scope of this battle, one must first look at Anne's long-standing reputation, a reputation forged not in scandal or media play, but in relentless, invisible labor. From the moment she reached adulthood, Princess Anne took on royal duties with a level of dedication that earned her both admiration and awe. She would routinely attend over 400 engagements a year, often traveling alone, without the support or glamour of the more visible royals. She didn't issue press STA. Instead, she showed up, again and again, to the Isle of Man, to rural Wales, to refugee centers in Africa, to obscure organizations that had long lost the media's interest but still needed royal patronage to survive. Over time, she became known as the hardest-working royal, a title she neither sought nor celebrated. It was simply who she was. And that image of steadfastness, of consistent reliability, became her greatest strength. Even her critics had little to latch onto. There were no explosive interviews, no tell-all books, no whispered rumors of political meddling or financial excess, and had lived a royal life in the purest sense, one governed by restraint, sacrifice, and quiet influence. But then came Meghan, an American actress with a global following, a voice trained for screens, and a personal story layered with complexity, biracial identity, divorce, philanthropy, ambition, and eventually, royal marriage. When Meghan Markle married Prince Harry in 2018, it was seen by many as a modern fairy tale, the blending of worlds, the evolution of the monarchy, the embodiment of inclusion and change. And for a time, that promise held. But beneath the surface, the palace and Meghan were already on a collision course, and had spent decades learning the delicate codes of royal restraint. Meghan brought with her the ethos of Hollywood storytelling, where transparency is currency, visibility is power, and silence often signals guilt. What the palace saw as confidentiality, Meghan interpreted as suppression. What the firm called duty, she sometimes experienced as dehumanization. And so began the unraveling, not just of Meghan's relationship with the institution, but of the monarchy's grip on its own narrative. The Sussexes' departure from royal duties, followed by their explosive media ventures, including the Oprah Winfrey interview, the Netflix docuseries, and Prince Harry's memoir Spare, marked a turning point in how the royal brand was perceived globally. For the first time in modern history, a member of the royal family was telling their story not through biographers or official communications, but through raw, direct, emotionally charged content crafted for maximum impact. And in that space, Meghan thrived. She understood camera angles. She understood tone. She understood how to tap into the language of trauma, healing, and resilience, the very themes that resonate deeply in modern culture. She wasn't just a royal. She was a voice, a brand, a protagonist. Her critics called it narcissism. Her supporters called it bravery. But within the palace, the response was far less ambiguous. For Princess and Meghan's approach wasn't just unorthodox, it was dangerous, and had always believed in the monarchy as an institution that transcended personality. It was a framework, not a platform. Royals didn't share their pain with the public. They carried it silently. They didn't monetize their lineage. They preserved its dignity. So when Meghan turned the lens onto her royal experience, framing it as one of cruelty, neglect, and emotional harm, and didn't just see a personal grievance, she saw a threat to everything she had spent her life defending. And did not respond with press statements or counter-interviews. She responded the way she always had, with presence. While Meghan and Harry were signing lucrative media deals and appearing on talk shows, and was quietly increasing her royal workload. She visited organizations that were losing donors due to bad press. She reassured military charities rattled by the Sussexes' exit. She stood by the king at public appearances, never commenting, but always there. Her silence became its own form of narrative, a sharp contrast to the Sussex media blitz, where Meghan's team curated dramatic lighting, raw confessionals, and stirring orchestral scores, and showed up in raincoats, shaking hands in community halls, occasionally making dry, unscripted jokes to volunteers who had no idea a camera was rolling. And the public began to notice. Poll after poll showed Princess and climbing in approval ratings, particularly among older Britons and traditionalists who saw her as the last bastion of real monarchy. But surprisingly, even younger audiences, many of whom had initially embraced Meghan's story, began to express admiration for Anne's work ethic and authenticity. The contrast between the two women became a constant talking point in the media. Headlines began appearing in British tabloids and international publications. Two duchesses, two paths. Why Anne may be winning the quiet war. And does 450 engagements without a fuss. Meghan drops a trailer. Princess and the royal without a PR machine. And the one who doesn't need 1 inch. And, of course, never commented on these comparisons. She didn't need to. Her public schedule spoke for her. Her stoic demeanor was its own rebuttal. Yet despite her refusal to engage, the battle for public image intensified, not because Anne or Meghan escalated it directly, but because the monarchy now found itself existing in two worlds, the old and the new. In one world, silence was dignity. In the other, silence was complicity. In one world, Tradition was stability. In the other, tradition was a cage. And it was in this collision of worldviews that Anne and Meghan became reluctant avatars of a deeper royal crisis. In private, Anne reportedly warned King Charles that the longer the Sussex narrative dominated headlines, the more the monarchy risked losing its grip on the global imagination. She didn't suggest fighting fire with fire. She suggested eliminating the oxygen entirely. No response is still a response, she said. But only if you show them what real service looks like. That sentence became a sort of motto for Anne's quiet campaign. Show, don't tell. Be present, not performative. Let the cameras film the work, not the drama. It worked. While Meghan's Netflix series sparked global debate and was quietly honored by several charities for record-breaking appearances and lifetime contributions. While Meghan's podcast was dissected by critics and media pundits and was chairing rural development forums in forgotten parts of the UK. While Meghan's fashion choices trended online, Anne's reworn outfits from decades past were praised for their frugality. It wasn't that Meghan lost the public entirely. Her appeal remained strong among audiences who see her as a survivor, a reformer, and a modern woman who challenged an ancient machine. But Anne's strength emerged not from her ability to counter Meghan, but from her refusal to play the same game. And in the long war for image, that may be the most enduring strategy of all. Because in the end, it's not always the loudest voice that wins. Sometimes, it's the one that never needed to raise it in the first place. Behind palace doors, a royal reckoning is unfolding, and at the center of it is Princess Anne, issuing a cold ultimatum that could shatter what's left of the monarchy's fragile unity. In a moment of razor-sharp clarity, Anne reportedly demanded her brother, King Charles, choose between family loyalty and royal survival. Tonight, we unravel the icy private meeting, the silent war against Harry and Meghan, and how a single sentence may have redefined the future of the crown forever. This isn't just royal drama, this is a full-blown institutional purge disguised as tradition.